Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking about winter gardening tips. Okay, it's November, and most of you are probably kind of getting things settled in, ready for winter. I know I definitely am. I'm spending a lot more time crocheting than doing things out in the yard at the moment. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about how you can be successful with winter on the way. And there's some common misconceptions about gardening in winter. And the first one is that you shouldn't really be planting anything. But in actual fact, there's lots of things that we can still be planting if the soil or the ground is still soft enough that you can dig a hole. That's also known as if you're able to work the ground. Okay, so if you haven't had a frost yet, and you can still, dig, there's plenty of things that we can be growing. Garlic is the number one veggie that you can definitely be planting right now. You don't want to be planting it somewhere that gets waterlogged because the cloves that you're planting will rot, and we don't want that. We want you to be successful, so make sure that you plant it somewhere that gets plenty of sunlight and that's free draining. You can also plant some bulbs. There's plenty of flower bulbs that you can be planting now in fall, and then they will, come up again in spring. So things like daffodils, tulips, those kind of things. They're good to be able to plant now. And also winter is a wonderful time to get in some fruit trees and berry bushes and things like that, because they're able to get established during the winter months when not much is going on. So how do we get those plants established? Well, first of all, we want to make sure that we are adding compost. This is known as dressing the beds, okay? I know it's a really weird word to be using for it, but you might also have heard the term of side dressing the plants, and that means like adding compost or a fertilizer to them from the side as they're growing. Well, in winter, we don't really want to be fertilizing particularly, but we can add a good layer of compost because it's going to supply those nutrients to the soil. It's going to feed the bacteria. It's also going to act as a mulch. So it's a good time to layer on some compost. Okay, we also want to add some mulch. Leaves are a great source of mulch, and fall is a good supply of those. Wood chips are another great mulch, and it does a couple of things. So it's going to protect that soil from erosion, from wind, rain, snow melting, all that good stuff. It's also going to help keep root temperatures stable throughout the winter, which means that your plants have got a better chance of bouncing back after a particularly harsh winter. So there are a couple of ways that we can help make those things that we're planting be successful. And I know this is really crazy because people tend not to think of watering during winter, but it's actually really important to water, especially if you've got a predicted freeze. So if you water in advance of that freeze, it's going to help them make it through that hard freeze, because plants are able to take up moisture before the ground's frozen, and it prevents the water from reaching the root zone, meaning that it's got a better chance of surviving. So if you're growing in containers still, you want to make sure that you give them some water before you've got a hard freeze. And this is really important in greenhouses, and if you're growing under hoop houses too, because things get really dry in there really quickly. So make sure that you give it a good drink of water. You might need to do it a couple of times throughout the day. So today, for example, I've been out this morning planting garlic, and we also lifted up the hoop houses, and we've had to give things water, and it's already kind of dried out in there. We've left the hoop houses off because it's actually a really nice warm day today, but we're going to have to water them again, definitely before the evening time, so we've got a chance for those plants to take up that water before we go ahead and pop that hoop or the polytunnel back on over it. Now, I mentioned greenhouses and hoop houses, and there's a couple of things that we need to think about before the really bad weather comes, especially with the greenhouses. You want to make sure that you are winterized, so you want to make sure that you've made any repairs that need to happen. You want to clean those the if you've got glass or polycarbonate, you want to be cleaning where the light's coming in, because the sunlight's going to be a lot weaker because of the position of the sun in the sky. Oh, actually, it's more to do with how the Earth's tilting, but I'm not going to give you guys a science lesson on space. But you want to make sure that those windows and things are clean to allow as much light into there as possible. Same goes for a hoop house. If you've got a bunch of dirt that's kind of accumulated on those hoop houses, give them a wipe down and make sure that everything's kind of nice and clean, so you've got plenty of light coming through, and that's really going to help your plants do better. And we want to make sure that we can try and keep things as warm as possible in there. So, you know, check if there's any tears or rips in your hoop houses, in any of your frost fleece, those kind of things, and, you know, get replacements if needed, because if it's badly torn, it's not going to protect from that cold. So you're going to need to get a replacement. So it's better off to do it early before you really get some, you know, bad weather in, and keep ahead of the game a little bit. You want to make sure that we're providing ventilation. So I mentioned it's a good, you know, it's a nice day today, and we've actually taken the hoop houses off to let the air circulate through. If you don't circulate the air, then you can get a buildup of fungal diseases that happen in there, and we don't want that. We want to make sure that you're successful in your winter garden. And another way to help that is to take care of the spacing around your plants. So you want to make sure that you've got plenty of air circulation around the plants that you are growing in your hoop house or your greenhouse. Of course, the best way to get the most from a winter garden is really to grow the right sort of crops. Now, if you live somewhere milder like the UK, there's plenty of veggies that you can be harvesting throughout the season. You may not actually need the frost protection for some of them, because it doesn't get as cold as what it does here within the US. Here in the US, you're going to be needing some sort of frost protection, especially if you're living in the northern states, and you might actually need multiple layers of frost protection to help keep your plants happy throughout the winter. Now, you want to be choosing the right sort of winter crops and the right varieties for growing, okay? Just because, you know, you're wanting to plant, let's say, a lettuce, for example, you might have a better time with a cold hardy variety like Winter Density, for example, than you are going to have like a summer bib, okay? So pay attention to the varieties, and actually most suppliers of seeds are really helpful in the fact that they identify fall and winter garden varieties of vegetables to be growing. So let's just take a little detour and talk a little bit about some plants that should be good for you to be growing in your greenhouse or hoop house, okay? So we're talking cool weather crops, okay? Those cold tolerant varieties. So we're not talking tomatoes, we're not talking peppers, okay? If it's a summer veggie, it really ain't worth your time trying to get it to grow over winter. If you're growing indoors, might be worth a try. I've never, really tried growing vegetables indoors, because, I have dogs who like to eat the veggies. So I spend more time having to battle that fight than try and grow them. And, it's, for me, growing indoors is more about seed starting than anything else, or doing some herbs on the kitchen sill. So don't try and do the warmer weather crops. You're going to need to provide extra heat and extra light to be successful with that. That's how the commercial growers do it. They're spending lots of money on heating and lighting. Okay, so let's just focus and work with nature on the cool weather crops. So we're talking things like spinach. There's things like Bloomsdale, winter Bloomsdale, lettuce. This, again, I mentioned lettuce already. You can definitely do like baby leaf lettuce. They work quite well. Things like red oak leaf, Rouge de Hiver. I'm not entirely sure if I'm saying that right. And Winter Density grow really well. They're definitely a cooler weather variety that you should look into and see whether they will do well for you. Arugula, also known as rocket in England, that's pretty good in terms of growing in the cooler weather. And it's got a bit of a bite to it, but it's actually quite delicious in the cooler weather, because in summer, if you're growing it, that heat can help like start make things bitter tasting, but in the winter you don't necessarily have those problems. So things like kale and stuff will tend to be a little bit sweeter. Asian greens, so we're talking tatsoi, bok choy, mustards, mitsuna, all those kind of greens do exceedingly well in the cold. And actually, they've got a lot of kind of these cut and come again qualities to them. So you can harvest a few leaves for a salad, and then, a few days later, you can come back and harvest a bit more. And more towards the end of winter and spring, you'll start to get those, bigger plants that you're able to harvest for things like a stir fry, or braising greens. And that's certainly what I did last year. Was I had a lot of Asian greens growing in the greenhouse, and we were able to get lots of harvests of those coming through before the bulk of the season came. Chard, I'm a big fan of chard. I love my Swiss chard. I've grown like multiple varieties. I love the 5-color silver beet though. That's one of my favorites to be growing. And that's done really well here. There's also the bright red Vulcan variety that I kind of like to grow as well. I like things that have got a color. So they've been very resilient for us, certainly in winter. When the temperature gets really low though, chard does need an extra layer to be able to keep it happy. If it's a big plant that you've got and you're just kind of popping some cover over that, it will have a little bit of frost damage to it. So consider using multiple layers if you're growing chard. Kale. Kale is great. I know it's like the Marmite of the vegetable world. You either love it or you hate it. I really love European varieties of kale, obviously because I'm English, but I really like some of the Scottish varieties of kale. So we're talking things like Scotch curly kale, and one of the new favourites that I managed to get hold of was Pentland Brig, and that's a really nice variety of kale. Also the Russian varieties, so the Ragged Jack or Red Russian kale and True Siberian are also really good at growing through winter. And indeed, I've had kale growing uncovered on the south side of the garden, and it's made it through winter. And that's actually what I took seeds from this year. I let it go to seed, and I was able to harvest that. So kale's definitely a great winter veggie to be growing, and you can use it when it's small in baby leaf salads, or again when it's a little bit bigger, and you can use it as braising greens. I've also got a variety that I picked up from Adaptive Seeds, and what was it called? Bare Necessities, and that's like a really interesting variety. It's very frilly and frizzy looking, and it's really quite interesting on the plate. So if you're wanting something that looks a little bit unusual, and you've never tried kale before, then Bare Necessities might be something that you quite enjoy, because it's got this kind of frilly appearance to it. There's not a lot of kale that you're kind of having to eat through there, so it makes it just a little bit more palatable. At least I've found when I've given that to my family. Whereas if I kind of rock up with a big stick of kale, because I've got some big varieties growing, like 1,000, no, not 1,000 Island, that's the dressing. 1,000 head kale, which is actually an English variety, and they have these big huge leaves and great for braising greens, although certain members of my family are kind of running away in horror at the fact that they're going to be eating that. There's also actually a perennial kale available, and you can find that at Rare Seeds, which is the Baker Creek heirloom seeds, and that's quite an interesting thought, is having a perennial kale that you can grow year round, and that one was grown out in Oregon, I believe. So that's kind of something to take a look at. And I think it's come from like these really tall like tree kales, or also known as a walking stick kale in the UK, where they get super tall and you can harvest the leaves up and up and up, but the stalk is so hard that it can be used as a actual walking cane, but from the looks of it, it looks like it's actually hardy in most regions of the country, and will survive to around zone 6. So that might be something really interesting for you guys to take a look at, as a perennial kale variety. Certainly if it's something that you guys enjoy eating. I think that's definitely one for me to try. That's quite exciting, although I think if my husband finds me buying more seeds again, we're going to be having words. So what else can we grow in our greenhouse at this time of year? Mash, also known as corn salad. They create these beautiful like little rosettes of greens, and they look extremely pretty on the plate, but they're really kind of a one harvest and you're done kind of deal. Vit is a good variety. I've definitely grown those in winter here in Utah, and they've done pretty well, and they get to about like 3 inches across, and then you just want to stick those in a salad. It is really slow, and that's kind of something to be aware of when you're growing over winter, is things grow so much slower because of the daylight is much less. That's not to say that the plants are paying attention to daylight savings time, but the light is a lot weaker. And for a good, strong growth, you see that really ramp up when the amount of daylight hours a day gets to be greater than 8, 9, 10 plus hours. That's when things go crazy. If you're living somewhere like Alaska, that's how you can grow these super huge veggies, is because it's daylight all the time for like half of the year. So that works really well. But again, if you're living places like that, then if you're growing over winter, it's probably going to be in some sort of sunken greenhouse, and it's going to be with supplemental lighting and potentially also heating. Claytonia is also known as, is this the one that's known as Parsley? I'm trying to remember the names of what we call it in the UK versus the US. It's also known as miner's lettuce, and they're kind of almost like these succulent leaves, and you need to get the winter Claytonia variety. There is a summer variety, I believe, and it grows pretty well. It actually grows where I live as a weed, but I've never seen it really growing over winter, so it does tend to die back. But then we've had some very cold weather recently, but it's something worth trying, especially if you live in a milder area and you want to try growing. Some herbs do pretty well too. Parsley is great. I love parsley. It's one of my favorites. I like the curly parsley or the moss parsley varieties rather than the flat leaf, but either grow quite well, especially if you're growing it under cover. I wouldn't necessarily plant parsley into a bed if it's in the greenhouse, just because it's like prime estate growing in the garden beds in that greenhouse, because I've only got 2 main beds in there. Everything else in the greenhouse is more for seed starting, and I'll probably do another episode or podcast about winter sowing for seeds a little bit later on, but for me, I wouldn't necessarily grow it in there. I would much rather be growing some of those other crops that we've talked about in the growing bed. But if you've got small containers, parsley is something great that you can be growing in there as well. Again, just make sure that you're keeping it watered and keeping it moist, because pots and things do dry out. And parsley is actually pretty versatile in the kitchen. I mean, if you're from the UK, you're probably very, very aware of fish with butter and parsley in a foil packet. Also using it in fisherman's pie. We like to add it to eggs and a whole heap of other things. So parsley is pretty good. It's also kind of nice to have it within a salad as well. So that's kind of the leafy things that we can be growing pretty successfully in a winter garden, in a greenhouse or under a hoop house and some frost protection. Carrots. Carrots are really good if you manage to get them to overwinter and taste really, really sweet and delicious. Carrots for me have been kind of hit and miss, mostly because we've been trying to find the right variety that's going to grow for us. Now, I think we've got a couple of varieties that might be winners for us to grow. So really, for success with carrots, we want to be, really sowing from late July to mid-August, okay? And then we leave those growing over the winter, and we're just kind of harvesting at that point of time. And the flavour is probably going to drop off as the daylight kind of ramps up again. And because carrots are biennials, they will send up flowering spikes that second year, and you can harvest the seeds and things from those. The stubby Chardonnay carrots or Parisian market carrots have been the ones that I've managed to be more successful with during winter, especially if I've left it kind of late. And that's something to be mindful of. If you're going to be sowing them now, it's November, you're not going to be harvesting anything until really for spring, because it takes a long time for carrots to grow. Also, the germination rate's a little bit hit and miss on them as well. And beets, are pretty good to be growing as well. They're not as cold hardy, just like chard. They can be a little bit susceptible to a harder freeze, so you're going to need to use some extra frost protection. And kind of November's probably really pushing it to be growing beets. You might be more successful growing beets as leaves for salads and things, and then kind of sowing them a little bit earlier in the following year to have early spring beets, which are pretty delicious and a quick crop to get in there whilst the rest of the garden's sleeping. So that's something to think about as well. And for beets, I mean, there's some really great varieties. Early Wonder is pretty good. Detroit Red has been very good, especially for leaves, because the leaves are red and they're pretty tasty. Bull's Blood is also a really good variety that we've managed to grow pretty successfully, even with the winter. Turnips, there's lots of different turnips that we've been very successful with growing. We've had a few that we've sown more early in the spring rather than winter. This year's going to be a little bit different. We've got some that have been planted over the winter, and they're going to be allowed to grow. And turnip greens you can also eat as well as the root. Japanese varieties are pretty good for growing over winter. You still need to cover them up. And you can use those, raw if they're small enough. But we tend to cook them. So there's a few varieties there that seem to work for us. We're still trying to figure out turnips and the best varieties that are growing for us. In terms of like a staple variety to grow, that is definitely purple top for us. And I can't remember the name of the Japanese variety that we grow, but I will put it into the show notes so you guys know. Leeks take a long time to grow. They are something that's typically sown in fall or transplanted in fall in the UK. and they're just kind of left in the ground and harvested in early spring. You also, if you've got ones that have planted in spring, most people tend to kind of keep them in the ground even in fall and just kind of harvest them as they're needed. We've got different varieties growing. We've got American Flag and Musselburgh, which is a Scottish variety. What's the other one? Blue Solace. That was a good variety that grew really well. And we've got some that have been sown for the fall, and they're currently under the protection of one of the hoop houses, and we've got some that we're still pulling now. In fact, we'll be pulling some to eat for Thanksgiving, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. Radishes are also pretty straightforward to be growing. They are a very quick growing crop. I mean, when the daylight is up to 10 hours or so, I mean, radishes can be ready within 21 days. Now, it's not to say in winter they're going to be ready in 21 days. Definitely not. They take much longer to grow. So I like the French breakfast radishes. We also like Cherry Belle. There's some different varieties that we've picked up that we're going to try, like the watermelon radish. That one I'm really excited by. It looks really pretty. And I think the other varieties that we picked up were called like an Easter egg radishes or something like that. They were kind of all these multicolored ones, and I like things to be pretty and different colored. So radishes are definitely something easy for you to really kind of start with. And the nice thing about radishes is actually they're quite versatile because you can eat the tops as well. You can saute them, use them as like braising greens, or you can use them in a salad if you don't mind. It's a little spiky, I guess. But then, where I come from, we eat nettles as well. So each to their own, I guess. But, it's a cool thing to really experiment with, starting them and, how long that they take to grow. And there's some really good resources available. There's some good books on winter gardening or year-round gardening. Elliot Coleman is definitely an expert in that field, and if you've not read his book, I really encourage you to do so. But ultimately, you need to find out what works well for where you live and your area and your greenhouses and your hoop houses, because there's nowhere else that's exactly the same as your garden. And even within your garden, there's going to be little nuances within there. So, like, for example, my greenhouse is attached to the shed, and that's over on the north end of the yard. And it gets light and stuff in there because there's no trees, that are blocking that light coming through, but it's mostly west facing. So I don't get as much light as what I do on my south facing side of the property where I've got the majority of the hoop houses. So things grow differently even within your own garden. And I really encourage you to experiment and just see what works for you and keep some good notes. Like, I can't really tell you enough that keeping good notes of when you started to grow something and what you grew means, makes a real good difference to being successful in your garden and learning what didn't grow well and what did grow well. For other parts of the country within the US, people are still transplanting things like broccoli and Brussels sprouts, and some of those brassicas. And, certainly like my family down in Texas and some of my friends down in Texas and Alabama, they don't need to be really covering things heavily like I do, or where some of my friends in the northern states do. Like my friends out in Minnesota, they definitely need a couple of layers of frost protection. Whereas, my friends down in Dallas, yeah, not so so much. You know, they've got Asian greens and leeks and stuff growing, and they're growing out in the open, and you know, they've not got as many cold days. In fact, I kind of really was super jealous when I visited the botanical gardens in Dallas a couple of Christmases ago. Or was it last Christmas? Was it last Christmas? Yeah, it was last Christmas. And there was just all this stuff growing out in the open, and I just kind of looked at my husband and was like, oh man, like everything that we're growing at home is under like 2 feet of snow. So you know, you've all got your different nuances depending on where you live. And you should really own that and try to take a look at taking advantage of your current climate and what you can be growing there and then. And, you know, if you're living somewhere like those southern states, really make use of it, because those cool season plants like peas, lettuce, broccoli, carrots, spinach, all that good stuff, you can really make the most of it and have some wonderful harvests growing, even though it's winter. And there's actually something really exciting about the fact that you could be harvesting veggies for your Thanksgiving dinner or for your winter holiday dinner of choice, you know, right out of the garden. And that's pretty fun to do so. So to wrap up, some main tips for your winter garden really is to make sure that you keep things watered, because things do dry out. You want to keep an eye on when your temperatures are getting super low. Make sure that you've definitely watered things that are in containers or in your greenhouse and hoop houses before that super low temperature gets there, and help to give your plants that opportunity to spring back a bit. Make sure that you are using your frost protection, especially if it's predicted low temperatures, and maybe consider adding an extra layer that's in there. Make sure that you ventilate your growing spaces if you're using a hoop house or a greenhouse, and it's a good warm day. You know, open things up a bit, make sure you get that air circulating. And definitely if you're transplanting trees at this time, or berry bushes, and maybe you're just planting some garlic or some flowers for spring, or those bulbs, make sure that you're adding some compost to those planting holes, and make sure that you add some compost and some mulch to your growing beds to help you set up for success next year. Until next time, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope that your garden grows beautifully.